This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the topic is American poet Wallace Stevens. I have two experts on his life and career, and we will begin the conversation in a moment. The subject of this show is American poet Wallace Stevens. I have two men who have written about him. On the left, you'll see Chris Byers. On the right, Edward Ragg. Let me just start by giving Chris a few minutes to talk about a little bit about his background, what drew him to poetry and the works of Stevens in particular. Chris?
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I've always been really interested in verse form, and after I graduated from college, I picked up Stevens' poetry, sort of just a way of keeping my brain alive. And I realized I could not understand this poetry all by myself. So I eventually went to graduate school, and that's when I wrote my dissertation on Stevens and verse form and music and these things. And then I've been writing a number of articles about Stevens, often about form and other things, for quite a while. And finally, the last 5-7 years, I've been engaged in a project of putting out a new edition of Stevens' collected poems, getting rid of 100 or so errors in that. So that's brand new and now. So that's that.
I know I have the collected poems that has been around for 25 or 30 years. How many errors and what sorts of errors were they? Were they just punctual errors, or were they poems that were reworked in any substantial way?
Well, there's over 100 errors in the collected poems, and basically what happened was the publisher wanted to rush it into print to get in time for Stevens' 70th birthday, and so they skipped a lot of the steps, and basically what they did was Stevens would publish a book and get republished, and they just got whatever edition was at hand as their sort of copy text. They didn't know in the process of republishing a lot of errors had crept into the text. Stevens' poetry can be very difficult, so proofreaders couldn't catch it because they didn't understand the poems there. The types of errors go from there's a poem left out to a lot of punctuation errors, spacing errors, a couple titles are wrong, there's errors in the index, there's errors in the table of contents, and wording errors. Generally, there's not mistakes like TEH for the, right? Yeah. Usually it's a word that could have been another word, but again, it would be very difficult to catch anyway, and given Stevens' difficulty, the proofreading job was given to proofreaders, and they did a good job proofreading, but they didn't know Stevens very well, and so a lot of times the word that's questioned could have gone either way anyway. So you really have to look to find these errors. You really have to go back to all the subsequent publications, compare all of them. And like I say, there's probably the most errors are spacing errors, where spaces were introduced or taken away. And if you're someone who's sense to form, those are significant errors.
Okay. Edward Ragg is a poet who's joining us from China, and he has written a book on the aesthetics of Wallace Stevens and his poetry. Edward, if you could give a little background about yourself and your book and your basic take on Stevens the poet.
Yeah, sure. So I was very lucky to start reading Stevens as a teenager. I had an American English teacher who came on exchange to my school in the UK. And one of the first poems I read just as a teenager was from Stevens' Harmonium, Disillusionment at 10 o'clock. And I wanted to write poetry at that time. And this is a really entrancing and remarkable writer, although I couldn't really understand that poem at that age. But later on, as a student, I came to work a bit on Stevens. I was certainly reading Stevens as an undergraduate. And as a graduate student, I wrote first a master's dissertation on Stevens' Harmonium, and then a PhD on the role of abstraction in Wallace Stevens' work. And that led to the book that you just mentioned, which is called Wallace Stevens and the Aesthetics of Abstraction, which came out in 2010. And the basic idea with that book is that although a lot of famous scholars of Stevens' poetry had sort of broached the issue of abstraction and what abstraction means in Stevens, how the poet is attracted to abstraction and so forth. There wasn't really a book-length study that tried to put all of this together as far as one can. And it's a pretty slippery subject, obviously. It's one with which Stevens himself was initially quite ambivalent. I mean, if you look at Stevens' poetry in the 1930s, he actually says at one point in a letter to Ronald Lane Latimer, who was one of his publishers, he said, "My real danger is not didacticism, but abstraction." And only a few couple of years later, Stevens is then writing The Man with the Blue Guitar, and he's really come to terms with certain kinds of ideas of artistic abstraction, particularly the work of Pablo Picasso. And then come the Second World War and the period of the early 1940s, Stevens' poetry has become noticeably abstract, as we're talking about abstraction. So in brief, I was just trying to get a handle on what this meant and trying to put this particular aspect of Stevens' work, which becomes so pivotal and central, into some kind of framework that could hopefully make sense. But that was the idea.
Since the end of the Second World War and the rise of MFAs and workshops, poetry has become more and more sort of self-obsessed, first with the confessionalists of the 50s and 60s, mid-century, but nowadays everything is all about the self. So it's almost as if Stevens' poetry seems even almost more alien and removed than poetry written maybe from the Romantic era. Do you think that what qualities do you see in Stevens' poetry that are akin to, say, the high modernists like Crane, Eliot Pound? And do you think that he attracts more readers now because there's something almost exotic about his poetry, or what? Because Stevens is still a big name, so what accounts for his enduring nature? Either one of you. Go ahead, Edward.
Well,
okay, go ahead. Go, Chris.
Okay, well, I'll start, and I'm sure Edward has something to say. Well, for one thing, it is absolutely the case that poetry today is really the poetry of voice. It's who you are. It's a kind of, you get extra points if you're black or a woman or gay or things like that. Stevens' poetry is very difficult to deduce, say, autobiographical information from. He doesn't write about himself very much in a direct way, in the way a lot of poetry does today. So in that way, he's kind of out of step with what's done, and also especially what's taught in schools, because a lot of the kind of approaches that people like to use are historicist approaches and poems that say things that everybody wants to get behind. On the other hand, there is such thing as language poetry, the kind of more experimental kinds of poetries that are coming along. The New York poets, in some ways, are influenced by Stevens there. So that if you're in a typical workshop, Stevens might be the antidote to what everybody else is doing in the workshop. That's certainly the case. I think also you would get a young poet might be very interested in his sumptuous language, approach to things. There's one other thing I think is worth saying about Stevens, and this is sort of the thesis of an article that he refused to publish, so there you have it. But I was making an argument called Wallace wrote a paper called Wallace Stevens, the Invention or the Discovery of Other People, and where I kind of said, beginning with the high-toned old Christian woman, where the speaker speaks at her but never really to her, and then we go on to the idea of Order of Key West, where he talks about her but never talks to her, speculates about her in a very different way, with a very different tone than we see in the high-toned old Christian woman, and I think there's a slow progress in Stevens about sort of refusing to inhabit the other point of view, refusing to be somebody other than I'm not, refusing to speak for somebody other than who I am. So while it's often taken a sort of hallmark of poetry that voices people's opinions and you create characters and so forth, for Stevens there's a kind of ethics in not doing all that. And I can see a person that gets uncomfortable with the sort of professional mode that you've mentioned would really like that. That's what I like myself. There's kind of the austere beauty of his language, the poems, the early harmonic poems, which were puzzles, and then the later meditative verse, which is sort of an experiment in reading, as opposed to just a poem that puts forth an image and we're all supposed to admire it.
Well, Stevens also is a poet that actually wrote about things. There's intellectual depth there, and there's a lack of cliches. If you look at most workshop poetry, it really is just prose broken into lines, and there's no reason for the enjambment that doesn't heighten anything. With Stevens chose words, he chose images for specific reasons, and I want to turn to Edward because of abstraction. To me, one of the keys to Stevens' poetry is the ellipses that he uses. He talks about things and around things without necessarily talking about the thing directly. So you get almost whatever subject matter he's talking about in cameo by talking around the thing. Is that what one of the keys to his abstraction, do you think, Edward?
Well, it's an interesting point, I think, and also just to chime in on what Chris was saying. From my perspective, and looking at Stevens sort of internationally, I think there's a very wide range of poets from all sorts of different backgrounds, writing in quite radically different ways, who are attracted to Stevens. I mean, those of us who kind of love Stevens' poetry, we seem to think that he's not read very much. But in reality, he is read quite a lot by quite a wide range of people. And I think you need to distinguish between the sort of Stevens of academe and gradually Stevens' position as a major 20th century poet has come to be realised within universities and on campuses and so forth, and a general readership for poetry, which we're always told is something that's kind of dwindled. But in reality, with the advent of the internet and the fact we're having a Skype conversation like this, it shows that there's actually a wide range of people around the world who are familiar with Stevens and warm to his work. And one book that may be of relevance to this, which is going to be published this year, is called Poetry and Poetics After Wallace Stevens, which is being edited by Bart A. Boots, the editor of the Stevens Journal, and Lisa Goldfarb. And I mention this particular book because it looks at how some quite, well, not unusual poets, but poets you might not expect to have picked up on Stevens or responded to Stevens. Nonetheless, we find avenues into these other poets' work through Stevens, or at least they can be read in tandem with Stevens. I've written a paper for this book which looks at Louise Glick's sort of ambivalence about Stevens, and also someone who seems in a completely different poetic universe at first, which is George Oppen. And I find a lot of coincidence between Oppen and Stevens, even though Oppen was not the kind of poet who necessarily would have warmed to Stevens. So I think there are some surprising avenues. But to come back to your question about ellipses and trying to get into the work, the more I read Stevens' poetry, the more I'm struck actually by how incredibly diverse it is. So we all have sort of poems that we pick out of the corpus, perhaps we mention and we remember rather, and some people teach. But there are poems in which Stevens can be almost kind of unnervingly direct, particularly in some of the poems in parts of the world. Now, sure, he's not a confessional poet in a mode that makes sense after his death. If you look at the poetry of the 50s and 60s, and we should also note, though, that there are plenty of confessionals who weren't happy with being called confessionals. But the other thing I'd mention is that Stevens, in his late career, in some of those meditative poems that Chris mentioned, they are intensely personal. Now, okay, he doesn't come out and say I very often, but he does say he in a way that seems to evoke an old man aware of his aging, aware of being and existence and the end of life, which is one reason why Stevens and Yeats are often compared, late Yeats and late Stevens, these a little bit like Wordsworth almost, the idea of a poet who's at the end of a kind of magisterial career. But at least with modernists, if we can call Yeats a modernist, at least with writers like Yeats and Stevens, there's also a sense of having failed in their enterprises. And that, I think, is the quite human side of late Stevens. That there has been a failure of sorts, even if it's a rather miraculous failure for those of us lucky to read Stevens' work. So I would say, actually, if you read through the corpus, Stevens has many different phases, many different faces, and considerably different tones as he experiments with different kinds of poem. So I think there can be a problem where people tend to sort of lump Stevens into one kind of category, and maybe Stevens can be blamed a little bit for this in the sense that he's always wanting to present this collective poems, as it becomes, as famously the whole of Harmonium. He wants to give the impression that his work is, in a sense, a complete statement, but it's a series of statements, and that's what I find exciting about it.
Let's talk about forerunners to Stevens. Do either of you, who would you put as influences on Stevens? I would look to some of the metaphysical poets, and also, even though he wrote more religiously, Gerard Manley Hopkins has turns of phrases here and there that I think that Stevens probably was aware of. Would either of you want to speculate on maybe the 2 or 3 poets that maybe are forerunners that Stevens was influenced by?
Chris, do you want to go first?
Okay, we'll start. Certainly, Stevens grew up in the 19th century, and so at the time, and when he's in school, everybody has to read Longfellow, and everybody has to read Tennyson. So some of those sonorities are there. Sometimes he plays around with them, especially in his early poetry. Another thing you can't overlook is like Paul Verlaine and Mallarmé. The French symbolist poetry are sort of part of the reason for some of his imagery and his sense of color, which he uses symbolically throughout. So those are, basically the same poets everybody else was reading is part of it, and part of it is certainly that. Of course, he mentions Whitman here and there, as a sort of Whitman kind of walks in and out of his poetry. For him, Whitman, I think, was a figure. I don't think Stevens is quite emulating Whitman, but for him, Whitman represents something that's important, especially if you want to call yourself an American poet, or I guess what Stevens would say, I'm ineluctably an American poet, even if I didn't want to be one there. So those are sort of a beginning thing. I mean, he's interested in Shakespeare, obviously, and there's a kind of sense, there's a few. One of the reasons for my dissertation was like the world's greatest Milton critic, and so he was always pointing out little Miltonic influences in Stevens as well. So in a lot of ways, he was a guy that was reading the canon pretty carefully.
Edward?
Yeah, exactly. That's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things when I was doing research at the Stevens Archive at the Huntington Library in Reno, California, I went a couple of times. On the second visit, I actually looked at a lot of Stevens' personal books, what he was reading, books he had as an undergraduate and as a young man. And indeed, he is reading, particularly the British Romantics. He's reading Longfellow, as Chris mentioned. It's pretty clear in some of Stevens' longer kind of poems written in tercets that they have a shape and a sense almost that reminds people of Shelley to an extent. There are, I should say, a number of echoes of Milton. So the British Romantics, certainly Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, who's echoed quite a lot, Wordsworth, to a lesser extent Byron. I haven't come across much Byron and Stevens. These are people he was reading, but your question was actually about influence. Yeah. So it becomes quite interesting. You can chart influence to the point where you can hear echoes of things. But is that influence or is it an allusion? And so sometimes it's a springboard for something, which could count as an influence as well. And certainly Whitman, I think, is important to Stevens, and you obviously read Whitman, and Whitman, as Chris mentioned, appears in some of the poems. And also, oddly enough, Yeats. I mean, I'm always surprised in, I think it's a page from a tale where Stevens actually is quoting Yeats at The Lake Arlen is Free directly. There aren't many instances of Stevens quoting poets directly, often in italics, other than perhaps early in Harmonium, where you're looking at nuances of a theme by Williams, where there's obviously a connection with William Carlos Williams. So it's a pretty broad range of influences, but quite how you chart influence in the poetry becomes an interesting thing, because Stevens, like many other poets, was quite curmudgeonly about influence. In one of the letters, he says, well, maybe I come down from Coleridge and Wordsworth or something like that. He kind of grudgingly says this, particularly in the late letters where he's got young aspiring graduate students beginning to write PhD dissertations or kind of graduate investigations of his work. And Stevens found that a bit difficult. He was occasionally, quite frequently, asked about what his poems mean or possibly where they come from, particularly by people like High Simon, but also by his Italian translator and other people who are asking him to actually say what his poems meant at certain points. And there's a funny side to Stevens, because on the one hand, he sort of is very resistant to explanation, quite understandably. But in other letters, he actually sets out quite long letters that are all numbered, referring to different parts of poems, in which he's trying to explain exactly what they mean, or tie down the meaning of the poems. I don't know if that was the lawyer in him, but it was something that grappled with as well, in terms of not only influence, but explanation of his work.
Later in the interview, I want to get more into, Edward, your thesis about abstraction, have both of you talk about what abstraction is, what Stevensian abstraction is. But before I do, I want to sort of end this first segment talking about the actual structure of the poems. And about a month or so ago, I spoke with a fellow, a well-known linguist named Samuel J. Kaiser. And Kaiser had taken a linguist's approach to Stevens, and I have about a little over an hour interview with him. And he divided Stevens's poetry into the short poems and the long poems. And he said that the long poems he couldn't get into, he couldn't break them down because they were just so long, and he couldn't get a handle on them. But he said the shorter poems, under a page or so, he noticed in maybe the dozen or 2 dozen of what he considered the best of Stevens's poems, he noticed what he called a fractalism, in that a fractal is a mathematic thing that it recapitulates. Like if you look at a shoreline and then you go closer in, 10 times closer, and you'll see the shoreline, has the same sort of look, and as you go further and further down, things retain the same type of appearance. And so he would go through some of Stevens's poems, and he would look at, for example, the way a word or a sound would repeat itself, and how something would be a precursor to something that came 3 or 4 lines earlier. So that was his take on the structure of Stevens's poems. Have either of you done any of that kind of analysis, especially on the shorter poems, which would be easier to do? Do you think that there was some kind of mathematical precision in the poems when he worked on them, when he conceived them, and then when he redid them? Or was it just something that he was just doing what came sort of naturally? Do you think there was a plan to Stevens's, especially shorter poetry?
Let me start here, because I did write a book called History of Free Verse. I do have a chapter on Stevens, and I do address this issue at some length. First, if Stevens had a mathematical formula or anything that precise, it would have been very, very odd had he devised such a thing and not ever talked to anybody about it. One of the problems with linguists in general is they want to apply whatever linguistic theory they happen to know to the poems, and without ever inquiring whether or not the poet knew these things. So either their theory must be true, or they're just sort of putting their cookie cutter onto the poem, trying to make the poems fit it. Very few linguists actually try to understand what the poet might have understood about linguistics, whether they might have intuited some of these rules. But if they're going to intuit a theory, they're not going to get it right. They're going to have their own understanding of language. And linguistic theories can take us a long way to noticing things, but it can't really explain them in the way that I would, where I would try to understand the poet's understanding and try to see what he typically does. As far as his form on short line poetry, there is a sort of long history of short line poetry, and of course Williams is our sort of foremost experimenter in it. Williams did not invent the short line, but he stayed with it for longer than most people. And if you read Williams's correspondence, he talks about it a great deal and is constantly seeking out people to talk about it. A lot of people started to abandon it shortly after sort of the imagism loses steam. Williams keeps it up. One thing that we have to understand about short line poetry is, previous to the free verse revolution, the open form revolution that happens in the teens and 20s, all poetry is rhyme and meter, but everybody says, well, rhyme and meter isn't really important. There's something really important now that's really poetic underneath. But the question is, if I'm going to throw away conventional rhyme, I'm going to throw away conventional meter, I'm not going to count syllables, for example, anymore. Then you have to ask yourself, what is determining the line? And that's sort of the thing that I was looking at in my book. And one thing that Whitman discovered was that you can use grammatical structures as an organizing feature of your line. So replacing counting with grammar, with phrases, right? Now the interesting thing about putting in phrases, grammatical structures for counting. Counting is very unnatural, right? If you say a sentence and someone says, how many syllables did you say? How many words did you say? You have to stop, write it down, think about it. But we speak naturally in phrases. We listen naturally in phrases. This is why Williams always said his meter was more natural, because grammar is an intrinsic feature of language and not sort of something that it's imposed to make it more musical, which is typical, though not only description of meter. So basically, what we start to see is, I think Edward mentioned, or you mentioned, excuse me, these sort of cutting things up into phrases. So basically, what Stephen started to experiment with, they all were lines that end in a complete phrase, lines which are jammed, there's some sort of interplay between them. And so the other thing that we have to think about is in the Imagist movement, the Imagists tended, not always, tended to define poetry as the image, right, which is a visual thing. And what you're supposed to do is sort of see the station at the metro with the pedals and the black bow and all that type of thing there. So it's a sort of substitution or a definition of what poetry ought to be. And the idea is anything outside of the image in that movement, where Stevens comes to move quite a way away from that, is sort of outside of poetry. It's less poetic, it's non-poetic as well. So basically, I think as far as Stevens, I don't think looking at very complex mathematical ideas is going to lead anywhere except to more and more sort of abstract ways of describing something. If you start looking at the Stevens actually looked at, grammatical phrases, lines and a half, or expressive purposes, you're going to get a lot closer. It's just true that if you have a short line, you have a lot less words, and you have to be much more. Imagism was in a lot of ways a minimalist movement. It was an attempt to get everything non-poetic out of poetry, which is sort of what every next movement always tries to do. And so the short lines were actually part of a genre that had already existed. It was the sort of most experimented genre in the 20s, and Stevens was trying his hand at it. He has other poems that are much more conventional or other ways, but I think that's how you would look at least his short line poetry as part of a continuum poetry with essentially a kind of grammatical phrasal meter.
Edward, your takes on if there was any kind of fractalism that this linguist had proposed?
I'm not sure I would put it in those terms, and I'm cautious about it in the way that Chris is for the reasons he's outlined. I don't think it makes much sensory to apply any particular kind of theory to be it linguistic or literary to read Stevens, other than one that's pretty broad and flexible. I don't see much point in sort of lumping together Stevens' short poems or long poems, although of course Van Vliet had a very important study of the longer poems in Stevens, and certainly things to compare. But in my mind, the short poems in Harmonium are quite different from the short poems in The Rock, even though there may be echoes between the books. So Stevens' approach to writing either short poems and shorter lines, or longer poems and longer kind of meditation or meditative lines, is something that differs across his career. What I would say is that if you think back to Stevens' Harmonium days, and really the period of the little magazines, it's true that he is thinking, as far as we know, in his poetry as to different ways of representing things, whether that's in 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird or 6 Significant Landscapes. I think the poem he gets closest to aping at least modernist art or modernist painting is a poem called The Public Square, where he writes about a slashed angular blacks, as he calls it. But even that is kind of descriptive. He's not sort of shortening the poetic line in the way that Chris mentioned with relation to Williams, and he never does what Oppen does either. Oppen, of course, is so much influenced by Williams. I remember hearing in the 70s when he said very emphatically that the poetic line has a left-hand side and it has a right-hand side. And he was very, very clear about it in a way that you don't see Oppen being as minute, not Oppen Stevens being as minute as Oppen in that sense. Of course, it would be foolhardy to say that Stevens is not interested in how a poem looks on the page. I mean, if you look at an early poem like The Snowman, that wonderful poem of one sentence across a number of stanzas, course, Stevens is concerned about lineation and poems look. But I think in his more expansive poems, this becomes less of an issue. I think they're written in a way that falls into kind of phrasal rhythm that occasionally have a kind of background meter. I mean, the person who's written a lot on this has been Natalie Gerber. She's looked, verse form in Stevens, and to what extent he's adhering to iambic pentameter or a version of it. There's a wonderful line in Harmonium in which the speaker says, "I am too dumbly in my being pent," which, if you read that back, it is in iambic form. I am too dumbly in my being pent, and it's a bit of a joke, I think, obviously, about pentameter, about iambic verse, and that's Stevens the dandy, if you like, playing around with versification to his own ends. So there's two things here we're really discussing. One, I don't see any point in trying to read Stevens through a particular lens. That's not going to lead to fruitful reading, I think, of this poet's work or from the end poet's work. And secondly, what is it that Stevens is doing in terms of lineation? And that's a very complex thing, something that varies across different poems and different books across his career.
Well, I know that when Kaiser was talking about it, he actually used the snowman as one of the three poems that he dissected. He thinks that the snowman is the greatest of Stevens's poems. I don't, but I know a lot of his argument remind me of a lot of the argument that people use for abstract expressionist paintings, sort of like, Pollock was really trying to talk about the movement of electrons in the atomic shell, and it's like, he had no fucking clue about that, but you're bringing things that the person had no clue about. And similarly, I don't think Stevens had any idea about what fractalism was, even though he could have, in some poems, intuited something along those lines. And I think for me, when I read Stevens, I wrote an essay called The Metric Fallacy. I think meter is one of the most ridiculous things. I mean, people don't speak in iambic pentameter. I've been doing a series of interviews, for example, with actors about Shakespeare and how one of the reasons many actors are sort of repulsed by Shakespeare is the stilted way of speaking. And when I think of Stevens, I think of the duplicity of meaning, and he uses enjambment oftentimes to get that duplicity of meaning. As I had mentioned before, the ellipsis and alliteration, assonance, these things that he uses in much subtler ways than you do in so-called formal verse. But let's end this segment here, and I want to dig more into Edward's ideas about what abstraction is, what Stevensian abstraction is, and we'll do that when we return. The subject is Wallace Stevens, American poet of the early 20th century. I've been speaking with two experts on his life and career. Edward Ragg has written extensively about abstraction in Stevens's work. Edward, if you could just first sort of give just a simple sort of definition of abstraction in art and what Stevensian abstraction is.
Yeah, I think it's actually quite hard to give a simple definition of abstraction because the area in which my book began, or its starting point, I should say, was the problems that the word abstract or abstraction represents, which is to say that for a lot of people it's pejorative. Something abstract is seen to be hard to conceptualize. It's maybe even inhuman, somewhat cold, something people can't follow or appreciate. Even as a verb, to abstract something obviously means to steal it or to make it less concrete. So I started in that book by thinking through what Stevens might mean by abstraction and how the different poems talk about the abstract, whether most famously in Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, with its first section entitled It Must Be Abstract, or in other poems where Stevens talks about abstraction. As I said a bit earlier, I mean, this was a theme in Stevens's verse that the poet himself was not keen to embrace at first. I think he saw that during the 1930s, in obviously the dark times of the Depression, that his poetry was drifting towards a certain kind of abstraction that he was uncomfortable with. And this is something that he tries to come to terms with in The Man with the Blue Guitar. But I suppose the ways in which I ended up thinking about abstraction and that I see at work in Stevens, they involve a slightly more human process, which is concerned with the imagination. In other words, how is it that a human mind reacts to the world, conceives of the world, imagines things, and interacts with that world? And so, to some extent, you can align Stevens' interest in abstraction with philosophical idealism. Now, okay, a critic like Kenneth Burke, who detected this in Stevens, said, "Oh, why is Stevens going on about abstraction and in the imagination? He's 150 years too late. I mean, surely this is what Coleridge and Wordsworth romantics were thinking about, or trying to come to terms with." But I think Burke kind of missed the point of what Stevens was trying to achieve, certainly in the period in which he was trying to achieve it. So, in other words, obviously Stevens was exposed to modern art, not just modern art, but modernist music as well. Like a number of Americans, of course, he went to the Armory Show in 1913. You know, as a scholar like Glenn MacLeod has looked at in some detail, Stevens was, in a sense, catapulted into a world of new representation. I mean, Stevens was a friend of Walter Arensberg's, the collector who introduced him to Marcel Duchamp. And it was in Arensberg's kind of salon that Stevens came across some artists we could associate with abstraction, shall we say. And then when Stevens felt that he was beginning to appreciate modern art or modernist art a bit more, initially he was very diffident about his capabilities of looking at paintings or sculptures. He became more confident. So, by the time you look at his work in the 40s and 50s and you look at the letters, then it's clear that Stevens is aware of people like Klee, Kandinsky, Mondrian, and others. And of course, Stevens was collecting art himself, and he was an avid reader of catalogues from all sorts of exhibitions from all over the world. He went to museums when he could, of course, in New York and also in Hartford. So what I'm trying to say is that Stevens absorbed a lot about modern art. I think overall his favourite painter was probably Paul Cézanne, and it's Cézanne who writes in some of his aphorisms about abstraction, and really the idea that the point of a painter's work is obviously not to copy reality, but to present a vision of it. Now, of course, Cézanne was not the first to come up with that, but it's a viewpoint that Stevens shares, and Stevens is dealing with these subjects. Cézanne's sense of abstraction, in particular, writes some of his lectures and essays on The Necessary Angel. So particularly in The Figure of Youth as Virile Poet, he mentions Cézanne. And he also mentions an art critic called Henri Faucillon, who he was reading in the 40s, who famously writes a book called The Life of Forms in Art. And one of the first Stevens was to look at that book in some detail was B.J. Legger, and investigating what is it in Faucillon's theories of abstraction in the art world that could have influenced Stevens. So there's a number of things coming together here. I'm not going to claim that I've said the last word on Stevens in abstraction. That would be absurd. And there's also different stages to how he deals with abstraction. I think the big thing I notice is that in the early 40s, Stevens starts banging a gong for abstract in his poetry, right at the point where the American new critics and people like John Crowe Ransom, who was publishing Stevens in the Kenyon Review and elsewhere, are turning their back on abstraction. They associate, in their minds, a version of abstraction with scientific inquiry, with a kind of reduction of the world, which removes us from experience. But Stevens' sense of abstract is different from all that. It's different from the abstraction that Pounder pours and that Eliot would have treated with suspicion. Instead, it's more of an imaginative process in which the poet, in a sense, is putting the world back together again through acts of the imagination in the poem. And I think this is what makes some critics a bit uncomfortable with Stevens, but most famously Marjorie Perloff, that Stevens is this kind of aloof music maker who's out of touch with reality. I mean, maybe the poet who bangs on about reality, but his kind of harshest critics take him to task on whether or not he is part of a living human and vulnerable world. But what I found after the early 40s is that Stevens kind of absorbs some lessons about abstraction, and he no longer makes it part of the rhetoric. In fact, his later poetry is very suspicious of what he calls rhetoric, and he comes to write a sort of bolder kind of poetry, to put it that way, which engages with abstract themes, but it doesn't have a kind of rhetoric and vocabulary that's saying, oh, it must be abstract, or the ultimate poem is abstract, whatever it might be, even if that's a later poem. So there's not one kind of Stevens in abstraction, obviously, just as you can't really say that Stevens' sense of abstraction is something that obviously wasn't susceptible to change. And I think this is a big thing for this kind of poet. He doesn't want to be laid down, not least by his own rhetoric. And famously, it was R.P. Blackmore in one of his essays in the 50s, actually called Abstraction Blooded, which he starts to talk about, how Stevens become the victim of his own vocabulary. And it's actually very interesting to look at the late criticism of Stevens, late in his life, the 50s, in which figures like Blackmore and also Randall Jarrell are sometimes very negative about Stevens, sometimes very positive, and they're both negative and positive criticisms usually have a relation to whether is Stevens too abstract, is he too specialist, is he circulating a vocabulary terms that are to the detriment of the poetry. In other words, people like Jarrell, particularly when he reviews The Auroras of Autumn, he's pretty negative as to how Stevens is kind of going off a cliff. And he basically says, well, Stevens is writing these airy, breezy, abstract poems which will be sailing over many heads for centuries from now, is basically what Jarrell says, and I'm paraphrasing. But definitely, when Jarrell came to read The Rook, he said, well, these are poems in which we've discovered what it is to be human. So there's this remarkable reversal, at least among some critics, at the end, as to what kind of abstraction you like. Because the thing I found interesting is that, okay, Jarrell winning to flag off The Auroras of Autumn for being sort of horribly abstract. He loves The Rook, but of course The Rook is filled with poems of different kinds of abstraction. So I think there's a richness to Stevens in abstraction, which has been overlooked to some extent.
Chris, your comments on abstraction, Stevens?
Well, certainly I would agree with most of what was said, or all of it probably. A note in passing, mentioned Leggett's work and Stevens and Cosmoetica. It's important to realize this is just not Leggett being smart, right, or being clever. Leggett went through Stevens' library, found his copies of Cosmoetica's books, and Stevens was underlining passages and writing notes in the so this is sort of thing where we can pretty much say yes, absolutely, he was influenced by this, or read it very carefully anyway. I think so. The only thing I would add to Stevens' abstractions, kind of put it in a slightly different context. In the teens and 20s, remember that one of the ways that Imagism defined itself was Pounce's Go in Fear of Abstractions. William College Williams says later, Patterson, no ideas but a thing. So something that a hallmark of this early poetry is this very thinginess. And Stevens sometimes goes in that direction and sometimes in the other direction. If you think about, Peter Quentin's Clavier, where it kind of starts with a thing with Susanna by the thing, and then kind of moves into abstraction in this last abstract nouns, let's say anyway, in its last section there. As Edward mentioned, in the 30s, he was really being tested by the left, right? When Ronald Latimer started writing him letters, actually he had his letters ghostwritten by a Marxist friend of his, and they were sort of attacking Stevens. Well, not attacking, but pressing him to engage in the Great Depression and the events leading up to World War II. So Stevens is kind of going back and forth, trying to write more politically engaged poems, but never quite super happy with the work that he did there. And to me, finally, from, say, the 30s until the mid-40s, Stevens' poetry tends to be about how do we deal with this great catastrophe that's happened, whether it's the Depression, World War II, and the things all around those two things. How do we deal with that? And to me, the key moment there is in Polo's Ponies practicing, where at the end he says, piece the world together, boys, but not with your hands, right? Somehow abstraction is the proper response to this, right, to this sort of ongoing catastrophe. Then later on, after the war happens, and that the sense of catastrophe is sort of fading somewhat, Stevens, as Edward suggested, really wanted to write a poem about how to live life. How can you find a way of satisfying the world where other things that you might have hoped to happen aren't happening well for you? And the way I always want to say, his greatest poem should have been Ideas of Order Ordinary Evening. Even it just wasn't a great poem, but that's what he was trying to do plenty of ways to live in a sort of ordinary life, and I completely agree. Finally, abstraction comes to be how you put together the world, right? Your understandings of things, and that without a sort of fairy tale of that transparent language where you can look through the language and see the thing, right? That's sort of the belief of images. I can look through the poetry and I'll see the thing right there that's being represented. And so in a sense that you can never really take the me out of it, there's a reason why he wanted to put as his last poem ideas about the thing, but the thing itself, because that wasn't the last poem he wrote, but he said, this is the one, no matter where I end, this is the one I wanted to end on. And in some sense that I've almost come up to the thing. I'm almost able to state that thing. Edward had mentioned that Stevens kind of saw his career as a failure. And there's a sense, I think, that it's notes towards a supreme fiction, right? That the thing that he's finally trying to get to is sort of the unstatable thing anyway. There's a question to Stevens about whether he could have actually succeeded and whether he believed the success was possible there. And I think in some ways that abstraction was a way for him to kind of talk about how the mind is putting the world together without having to assert absolutely there's a thing there that I can know certain.
Edward, you had mentioned Cézanne, and it's interesting because when I think of painters that paint and deal with topics in the way Stevens does, the two that most come to my mind are René Magritte and Salvador Dali, especially Magritte. I mean, Magritte would have, this is not a cigar, this is not a pipe, and the painting of a pipe, or would have someone, the outline of someone removed and the person stand. So you'd have all of these kinds of things, this displacement. And when I think of Stevens, one of the things I think the most of is the idea of the thing, whatever is being talked about in ellipsis or directly, somehow being displaced. And another thing that comes to mind is, and maybe you could address this, is the idea of magical realism. In prose, when I've read so-called magical realists, usually they tend to write about things dealing with supernature, the supernatural or paranormal in some way, people who can do things beyond whatever, sometimes religiously based. But when I think of and read Stevens's poems, I think of magical realism, but realism in which the magic is in the real thing that he's talking about, not in supernature. Do you think that people like Magritte or magical realism had, I mean, he came before those things. Do you think that some of his poetry perhaps may have had some effect on some of these things? Do you think that maybe he had seen, especially someone like Magritte or Dali, and had some kind of effect? Because in a lot of ways, I think they were dealing with a lot of similar things, or at least they were doing it in ways similar in their respective fields.
Well, it's quite interesting you mentioned Dali, because the other thing that happens with Stevens in the 30s is it becomes pretty clear that he's resistant to surrealism in particular. And so when Stevens writes this essay, it's really a lecture that he gave at Harvard in 1936 called The Irrational Elements in Poetry. He writes about surrealism. There's also a note later on, I think, in the Adagio or some of the notebooks where he talks about what he considers to be the failure of surrealism. And I think one of the things he has a difficulty with is he says that, okay, astonishing things can come out of dreams, but they don't involve the kind of constructing artist, at least in the sense that, he looks at the lobster telephone as the example he gives, or I think he talks about a clown playing an accordion or something is not really invention, it's just, a kind of accident or juxtaposition, if you like. So Stevens, in a way, certainly distances himself from surrealism. I'm not aware of Stevens writing about Magritte at any point, and not that you were asking about that necessarily. About magical realism, I'm not precisely what I mean, but certainly if you think about Stevens and the supernatural, or you ask about magic in general, if there is magic in Stevens, then it is caught up absolutely in the mind's interaction with the world. And also, there is a very physical side to Stevens. This is something that people forget, and it was Helen Bendler in her book Words Out of Desire, if I remember the title correctly, which is trying to say, well, listen, Stevens isn't all about kind of dry philosophy or something like that. There's a living, human, breathing poet in these poems, even if he's not foregrounded in the way that a confessional poem might be. So there is a huge amount of human desire in Stevens's work, sometimes suppressed, sometimes longing for life and the world, particularly in the early poems, things like "Oh Florida," "Been a Real Soil," or that very depressing poem called Depression Before Spring, in which Stevens is sort of he's imitating bird sounds. The line something about "Rukuku doesn't it brings no answer" or something like that. I'm paraphrasing badly, probably because it's quite late here in Beijing, but there's trying to emphasize is that if there's a magic in Stevens, it takes place on several different levels, and it's not something that is particularly interested in the supernatural. Stevens is read by all sorts of people, people who have religious tendencies, people who have other kinds of belief, and it would all depend on what you mean precisely by magical realism. That's an area I'm slightly
Well, that's what I was meaning is that Stevens could look at, say, a teapot and take that as something that he would expound to a poem, say, about the nature of reality or something, whereas a magical realist would be focused on the magical side. The magic that Stevens sees in the world is in the plain everyday thing. That's why I had mentioned earlier the metaphysical poets. Even though Stevens is not religious the way a John Donne was, for example, he will look at something, maybe the sun coming through a window or something, and he infuses that with his words and his ideas into something more than just the warming light of morning kind of thing. Chris, any comments from you about Stevens and magical realism or metaphysical?
Yeah, my understanding of magical realism is not so much full magic, but of images which people believe. I'm thinking about like the very old man with enormous wings, where this guy with the wings apparently shows up, and everybody tries to fit him in their categories of what an angel means. And in the last scene, he gets up and flies away, and the woman she's at the sink washing dishes or peeling potatoes or something like that. She looks out and she watches him as he flies away until he becomes, as Mark is right, an imaginary dot, right? And so all of a sudden he's just in her understanding of the world, and so that I would say the magical realism not really filled with magic per se. It's filled with conceptions about the world, which we're willing to believe all kinds of things there. In that way, yeah, I would say Stevens is very much like that. That he's very much not into the thing so much as it's the way that it acts on our imagination. But of course, he's always has this sort of other side of him. Remember in Comedian Letter C says the poem exceeds its the plum exceeds its poem. There's something about reality that's so something that it cannot quite be completely captured in language. I just want to talk very briefly about Depression Before Spring, which Edward brought up. What happens is dove sound makes dove sound, but there's no kiki-riki, which is a French rooster, what the rooster says, and that's a sex poem, right? That I'm making the crow. It's spring, and I'm supposed to be having sex with my wife, but the crow can't. The cock can't crow. And something about that poem. This is completely off topic, but I've never had a chance to tell anybody this. I too was in Huntington, and I was also down at in Texas at the Ransom Center and a bunch of other places looking at all Stevens' stuff as part of that project for the text. And I am completely convinced that Stevens had a thing about feet. And that, one time when he's away from work and he's coming back, he's on a business trip, and he's on his way back, he writes this isn't in the letters. And he says, when I come home, why do you put on those slippers? Those slippers you have. So the word slipper has some sort of erotic connotation to it. And that poem is sort of non-abstract way of talking about something that probably would be difficult to talk about directly in that there. But getting back to your thing, like I say, I think that if the question of magical realism is all about making something out of the world, right? Makes sort of a magical use of the imagination. Absolutely, Stevens is doing that. But as Edward says, it's hard to think of very much magical that happens in Stevens. We don't see people flying around the room. We don't see flowers spouting from wounds and that type of stuff.
There's a magic. It's like angels surrounded by Pazons, and the necessary angel that's there for a moment in the doorway and is gone. It's that kind of imaginative magic that captures Stevens' imagination.
Earlier it was mentioned language poetry, and I've always thought that's one of the great misnomers. To me, that's just typographical or gimmick poetry. It's not. There's not even a lot of visual poetry. It's just placing words or letters here or there. To me, when I think of real language of the last 20th century, in English language, Stevens, Hart Crane, Sylvia Plath stand out as people who took sometimes words or ideas that people say, oh, this is too difficult, but they sort of squeeze all the juice out of them. Pablo Neruda in his love poems in Spanish also did a similar thing. Do you think that, when we talk about language poetry, that there should be sort of a differentiation between the, asterisk, A asterisk language poets and the real language poets who take phrases and lay a clause upon clause or use a chorus, antichorus in terms of imagery, the antiphonal kind of thing, things that Stevens and, as I said, Crane or Plath were doing. And do you think that we're just in an age right now with that kind of complex approach to the universe and writing about it is just something of the past?
Oh, I wouldn't say so. I think I'm not an expert on the language poets. I'm familiar with some of their work and the extent to which a figure like George Oppen, in a sense, becomes an influence on some of them. Or you have experimental poets like Susan Howe, who's interestingly also influenced by Stevens, which is a surprise to some people. But I actually see, from my perspective at least, a very rich world of different not so much schools of writing poetry, but different forms of poetry. Some of which are controversial. I mean, you look at the way in which creative writing programs have changed. I come from the UK, which traditionally didn't really have creative writing programs, and then they came in later on, partly through an American influence to some extent. As I'm a poet, but I've never been through a creative writing program myself. What I see in terms of how some of the teaching has changed is that people are, hence this sort of notion of uncreative writing, if you like. The idea is that you can pick up bits of text from wherever you might find it and copy and paste them. People have got quite upset about that and so forth. I think I see a very rich range of different ways of writing poetry, so I'd be a bit uncomfortable saying that language poetry is also pretty old. It's been around for a while. There's lots of different ways in which people write poetry today, and it's a sort of take it or leave it thing. It's not that you have a whole generation of poets who don't know how to write anything but are good at copying and pasting, and an older generation of the quality of Elizabeth Bishop, who there aren't many poets who come along quite like her. So I'm more optimistic in that I see some remarkable young poets producing really quite extraordinary work. People in my own generation in the UK, people like Sarah Howe, for example, poets who are a bit more experimental, maybe like Sam Riviere, and there's some remarkable people, and they're writing in different ways. And not surprisingly, but I wouldn't say that the language poets equal something, and we've lost a kind of a world of rich, resourceful poets that kind of died with Sylvia Plath. I didn't see that necessarily myself.
Chris?
Well, for sure. I talk about the language poets because they're nice and extreme, and they're sort of a way of talking about one thing. I think that when we're really talking about language poetry, we're talking about poetry that's written from theory in some ways, and a poetry that is intensely interested in its own mode of articulation. If we kind of talk about some of the poets that you were talking about, there's sort of a two cross critiques that we can make in the way that language poetry sometimes sort of seems to devolve as a discussion about itself, a discussion about language, and we never get to whatever the poem is supposed to be about, assuming the poem is supposed to be about something. On the other hand, if you want to write like Hart Crane or Dylan Thomas, you kind of have to believe that there's a there there. There's a thing there that I can know, and I'm expressing something. And I don't know if Stevens can ever quite say, I'm sure there's a there there, or I really feel, I think he says, I really, really feel like there's a there there, but I'm not going to quite go that next step. I'm going to rarely do it. If you think about the progression of median the letter C, where he tries to be this poet, tries to be that poet, and ends up just trying to make his own way in the world that's there. So what happened with language poetry kind of invigorated poetry in some ways, and made poets sort of upward challenge that you can sort of incorporate in your own and go somewhere else with it, or reject wholly and go in a completely different direction. Poetry is always it's always like, and that's great, because each new poet, new generation poet needs something to completely reject and go in a completely new direction, or at least feel like it's doing that. And so I gotta say too, there are times in Stevens where it does seem to be just a talk about language, when he starts to go closer and closer to nonsense. If you try to work your way all the way through the pure good of theory, that kind of Flatish poem there gets to be some really, really dense wordplay, where all of a sudden you start to wonder if the poem has finally lost its moving with some sort of reality, some sort of idea behind there. So like I said, I don't take that kind of dire view, and I think that every new challenge to poetry just gives something rich. I'll just add one other thing about the way that poets read other poets is, as a critic, I look back, I look at their historical and philosophical directions and stuff like that. Poets tend to read other poets for material. They don't have to eat the whole thing. They don't have to understand the whole thing. They just have to find something that's usable that they can use for there. And sometimes poets will bring together things that you think, you can't, those two are completely opposite. You can't bring those together, and they just do it, right? So I don't think there's any great fear or that language poetry has done any great harm to it, and I don't think there's anything to find an antidote for it either. Poets are going to go their own willful way no matter what we do.
I think that Stevens is probably one of the most misunderstood poets. I've done shows previously on Robinson Jeffers and Hart Crane, and there were misunderstandings, I think, about their work as well. But with Stevens, it seems there's even more of a detachment. A lot of critics are sort of aimlessly wandering in the Stevensian forest, and sometimes they'll call him a Vedic poet, which I don't see. I don't think there's anything, prophetic in his stuff the way there would be in Jeffers. I think he's definitely a visionary poet. You can talk about a Stevensian worldview the same way you can talk about a Yeatsian or Whitmanian worldview. But I think some of his poems themselves are often misunderstood. I know I had spoken with the linguist Kaiser a little bit about that. For people who are just coming to Stevens, if either one of you can name one or two poems that you would recommend as sort of essential Stevens, and I'll start with, and I'll give my choice first, and that's the poem Yellow Afternoon. And that's, I think, a very misunderstood poem. And I think it's, if I had to pick a choice for his greatest poem, it's that one, because almost every young poet that reads it, I say, what is that about? And they'll talk about this, that, and I say, no, it's a poem about death. I mean, if you really read that, it's about someone presumably lying under the earth talking about death, not metaphors of death, but actual death. And in a way, it's almost like a grand guignol horror poem. And it's one of the scariest poems if you actually read it. And I think it's the poem of Stevens that is, amongst all his great poems, is the sine qua non. Just in the same way that I think Ozymandias is Shelley's greatest poem, and the way that Stopping by Woods on Snowy Evening is Frost's greatest poem, even though they had other great poems. Which poems would you say are the essential or best poems, one or two poems that you would recommend people dive into first? Chris, you want to go first?
Well, okay, the question is just trying to understand Stevens' worldview and so forth. I would start with Man with the Blue Guitar, because he's really sort of overt about stating where he's at. Compared to the other poems where these things are stated in images and elliptically, this tends to be a discussion about the poet's way of understanding the world. And I think there's enough in that poem that goes through his whole career that would be. But that's not his most enjoyable poem. right? If you want someone just to like Stevens, and you want to give them like 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird and those types of poems, the beautiful little puzzle poems of the harmonians, although those aren't really representative as corpus, those are things that are contextualized. But the other thing I would suggest, where I kind of am more interested in nowadays, would be poems like Large Red Man's Reading, or even Marshall Cadenza, poems about reading, about the engagement of the text, where in Marshall Cadenza, he's trying to come to grips with something, and he tries out a number of different ideas and tries to come. It's basically about the war. Likewise, this whole process of reading, which Stevens sees as really a imaginative type of thing, and if the rest of your life is not working out as well as you wanted to, reading is still there. Keats said poetry can be a friend of man, or something like that. I think Stevens finally kind of came down to that. So those would be some of my choices.
How about you, Edward?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you're recommending. For the reason Chris gave, you're trying to get someone sort of excited about Stevens, and there are poems that have astonishing sound effects from harmonium that you might recommend, or even quite funny poems like The Plot Against the Giant. I've actually been in the last year or so teaching some of my students here in China. I've had Stevens' poems in my classes before. I've been teaching about 10 years here, but I set up specifically a Stevens reading seminar, so I was confronted with this issue of what am I going to present to my students, and I'm lucky to teach some of the brightest students in China, so I've got some very, very intelligent young people in the room with pretty high English levels. And what I chose, I began actually with earthy anecdote. I mean, if you go right back to that first poem in Harmonium, which gets some wonderful responses. I think, some people find it disarmingly simple. They even wonder if it is a poem. They think about the whole narrative of the poem, that it has a kind of pathos to it, in which the fire cat just sort of, sleeps and nothing seems to happen, but of course it does. So there's the Stevens of kind of game playing and narrative and surprises, and even the absence of surprises. And there's the Stevens whose work is so beautifully sonorous. I mean, if you think of the I.J. Roderick mentioned, one of the poems I put before my students, again from Ideas of Order, is Mozart 1935, which is such an intriguing poem, both in terms of how we have the foregrounding of this classical composer and the midst of the Depression and what's going on in that poem. Other poems that come to mind that are particularly evocative for thinking about both Stevens and poetry and why you begin reading Stevens in the first place, I guess I could choose Of Modern Poetry. And in terms of what Chris was saying about the whole enjoyment of reading and readers and kind of entering a Stevensian world that is made magical by reading, one of the later poems, The House Was Quiet and the World Was Calm, is a particularly evocative poem in that sense, or maybe even like the plain sense of things. So, I mean, it's such a diverse corpus. I'm sure there's other things I would choose, and actually, having taught this special seminar, working for students who'd never come across Stevens before, I was wondering, why did I choose these poems? And in the end, a lot of them, it came out, a lot of them were focused on nothing. Now, you mentioned that The Snowman is one of your favourite poems, but when I put together The Snowman and then A Rabbit as King of the Ghosts, and then I think The Plain Sense of Things and others, there's a way in which, quite enticingly, you get excited about nothingness in Stevens. And I think for some Western readers of poetry, that becomes a slightly frightening concept. For my students, at least in China, they're not too frightened of nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. They're quite happy talking about the nothing, if you like, and what that might mean. So, I mean, there's so much in Stevens one could recommend, but those are some of the parts I would highlight. And actually, in relation just briefly to what Chris said about the pure good of theory, which does become an increasingly bizarre poem, particularly in its close. This is a poem I wrote out at some length. I think a reviewer pointed out I spent 20 pages in this book writing about the pure good of theory. So in my book on abstraction, I tried to read that poem in light of abstraction and metaphor, and a sort of battle between how metaphor tries to realize the world and how abstract stepping to some extent to one side from it. Oddly enough, I would choose The Pure Gooder Theory as a great poem to recommend to people. Maybe not as a first poem to read by Stevens, but certainly one that could get people thinking, I'm sure.
Yeah, Stevens was almost, I think, one of the first writers, poet or prose, to deal with meta ideas half a century before postmodernism came along. Well, let's end this segment here. And in the final segment, I want to give you both a chance to wrap up any final thoughts on Stevens and his work, and we'll do that in a moment.
Yellow Afternoon by Wallace Stevens. It was in the earth only that he was at the bottom of things and of himself. There he could say, "Of this I am, this is the patriarch, this it is that answers when I ask, this is the mute, the final sculpture, around which silence lies on silence, this reposes alike in springtime, and arbored and bronzed in autumn." He said, "I had this that I could love, as one loves visible and responsive peace, as one loves one's own being, as one loves that which is the end, and must be loved, as one loves that of which one is a part, as in a unity that is the life one loves, so that one lives all the lives that comprise it, as the life of the fatal unity of war. Everything comes to him from the middle of his field. The odor of earth penetrates more deeply than any word. There he touches his being. There, as he is, the thought that he had found all this among men in a woman. She caught his breath, but he came back as one comes back from the sun, to lie on one's bed in the dark, close to a face, without eyes or mouth, that looks at one and speaks.
The show has been about American poet Wallace Stevens. I've been talking with Chris Byers and Edward Ragg about his poetry, how he's been received, and also ways that he infused things into some of his poetry. Let me start with you, Chris. If you could take a couple of minutes, talk about Stevens, any final thoughts, and again, anything especially for those first encountering Stevens' work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been reading Stevens for quite a while, and when you edit the text, you read it in a completely different way than you normally read. You have to pay attention to every single word. And of course, once you find yourself following the poem and getting into it, you have to stop, because then you might miss an error or something like that. But collectively, the mind puts things together and starts thinking about it. And when I was looking for a text to teach in my sort of how to be an English major course, my theory methods course, one of the poems I decided to put on there was a poem called Postcards from a Volcano. And in my reading of it, anyway, it's sort of a poem about how whenever you read a poem, it's like coming upon an archaeological artifact. There was a person there who had desires. All we have here is this artifact, which we have to kind of interpret from our subjectivity. And we can never get, even if we got to that person there, reconstruct that person. That person now is somewhere else. He's dead, or thinking something else, someplace else. And so my advice for engagement into Stevens is to appreciate that process of reading, the way that the poem unfolds. Stevens very rarely writes a wisdom poem where there's just a great meaning, and here it is. Let me give you an example of it. It's really, so many of the poems are about this process of kind of coming to understand it. I like Edward's talking about the first work in his corpus. The first poem, because it gives you this very sharp image. It offers no interpretation of it, and the bucks are chasing the Firecat's chasing the bucks, and something's happening there, but it's really hard to locate it in reality. And so it almost invites these questions of reading and interpretation. What context you're going to put this in? Is this really just about a predator chasing prey, or about something else? And that's what I think, finally, for me anyway, in my 50s, the pleasure of Stevens is that sort of luxuriousness of reading and enjoying the thing as it goes on, and following the mind that you're following there, and sort of trying to understand it in that way.
Edward, final thoughts from you on Stevens?
Yeah, I think that if anyone's interested in reading Stevens, I would advise starting with Harmonium and reading as much as you can and working through the books. Having said that, Harmonium, it's in a sense, it's not a book that Stevens wanted to write, at least as a book, which is to say that a lot of the poems that appeared in Harmonium, they appeared in the little magazines. And Stevens was not in a rush, even though he was in his early 40s, to produce a book. It was Carl Van Vechten who said, well, why don't you put a manuscript together? And so the reason I mention this is that when people first read Harmonium, they may find the poems so surprising, so unusual. I mean, how many poets can get away with writing a line like, fact, 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 I am the personal? You know, most people read those lines, either they've got to have a pretty broad sense of humour and an active imagination, or they might be repelled by them. And there is a side to Stevens that people can be repelled by, but Stevens' repulsions, and I don't mean he's being repulsive, are as interesting as his engagements, whatever you find engaging. So, you know, I persevere with Harmonium, and for one thing I feel is that there's almost undue reference put on Harmonium. We have a bit of a problem that Stevens, in terms of how he's been anthologized, it's partly his own fault because of his selections for the selected poems. There's a lot of Harmonium in his selections, and so Harmonium's had a lot of interest, and people think that is Stevens. But, you know, as Chris knows very well, and as lovers of Stevens' poetry know, there's more to Stevens than Harmonium, even though it's a big book. And then there's the 12-year gap before he produces Ideas of Order, and firstly in 1935 with Alceste, then with the Trade Edition in 1936. So, without going into too much detail, I think, you know, read through the book, but read chronologically and see what you notice. I mean, the first time I did this, I just ended up with a copy of Stevens' collected poems that had page references going back and forth. What you notice in Stevens in terms of his repetitions, his echoes. And what I would say, even when, you know, my students in China who come to Stevens for the first time in a second language, is they find it enjoyable in the same way that they seem to find E. Cummings enjoyable. Whereas, you know, Eliot, as much as I love Eliot, there are parts of Eliot that aren't particularly enjoyable for first-time readers of modernist poetry. And there's certainly a lot of Pound that's not enjoyable for first-time readers of modernist poetry. So, you know, I'm not going to be overtly critical of the two writers, but at least Stevens is pretty fun. At least a lot of readers find Stevens fun. That's why John Serio, for example, put together that collection of Stevens' poems for children, you know, the more exciting poems. He can be read almost, in a sense, as I'm not advising this for parents, but as a kind of bedtime story. There's a side to Stevens which could maybe put you to sleep, but could also hopefully enchant you as well. So, yeah, with reading Stevens chronologically, I don't think it makes much sense just to skip around unless you don't feel you have the stomach for reading all of the books, essentially.
Well, anyone who's enjoyed this conversation, I have links to the web pages of both Chris and Edward. You can contact them there. I want to thank you both for talking about Wallace Stevens. He's a poet that should be read. And again, thanks for your time.